Competition in the Wireless Environment, How to Get More Handsets and More Networks. Before I introduce our moderator, we'd like to thank the sponsors of the Broadband Breakfast Club, National Cable and Telecommunications Association, NCTA, Telecommunications Industry Association, TIA, and the United States Telecom Association, US Telecom. And I also want to point out to you that on the table you have a survey. We ask if you would please fill it out. We'd love to hear what you think of the event, and hope you can contribute to our ideas for future events. And without further ado, I'll introduce our moderator, Jonathan Charnitsky, who's the managing editor at BroadbandBreakfast.com. Jonathan began his career as a journalist before turning his focus to law and policy. He is an attorney licensed in Texas and the District of Columbia. He has worked previously as a political reporter in political campaign communications and on Capitol Hill. He holds a BA in journalism from the University of Washington and a JD from Villanova Law School, where he focused on studies on Internet and intellectual property law and policy. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Charnitsky.
Thank you, Sylvia. All right, good morning, everybody. I am excited to be here. This is actually the first time I'm moderating, so bear with me a little bit if you would. But welcome to this morning's Broadband Breakfast Club, Competition in the Wireless Environment, How to Get More Handsets on More Networks. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our panelists this morning. Thank you for being here, everybody. First, we have Coleman Bazelon, who is a principal at the Brattle Group. Dr. Bazelon advises regulatory and legislative bodies, including the U.S. FCC and the U.S. Congress, and also has expertise in the federal government's use of discount rates for policy and regulatory analysis, intellectual property valuation, and antitrust and damages analysis. Next, we have Seth Bloom, who serves as General Counsel of the Senate Antitrust Subcommittee on the staff of the Chairman, Senator Herb Kohl. He is responsible for antitrust, competition, and other business regulation issues for Senator Kohl. Parul Desai is Communications Policy Counsel for Consumers Union, the nonprofit publisher of Consumer Reports. Working out of the D.C. office, Parul manages the organization's advocacy efforts on cable, wireless, telephone, and internet policy. She's also responsible for working closely with federal policymakers on telecommunications and media law and policy. Julia Tanner is General Counsel to MTPCS, a Cellular One carrier in Montana, and its affiliates in Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. She established and manages the legal division of the group of wireless telecommunications carriers, advising officers and executives on matters including transactional, consumer, and regulatory law and proceedings, and coordinates the work of outside counsel. Our topic today is particularly timely with the debut of the iPhone on Verizon's network last week, after more than 4 years of exclusivity with AT&T. During today's panel, I'd like to explore the nature of exclusivity agreements between handset manufacturers and wireless carriers, compare today's environment with historical examples of network-connected devices, examine legal issues such as antitrust surrounding these exclusivity agreements, and finally, look at how those agreements affect not only the larger carriers who make the agreements, but also the smaller carriers who may not be able to bring the latest devices to their networks because of that. So if I could just start off and get each of you to kind of go down the line and explain briefly a little bit about your organization and how exclusivity agreements affect you. So, Dr. Bazelon.
Sure. So the Brattle Group's an economic consulting firm, and other than occasionally doing work in this area, it doesn't affect us too much. We're a litigation consulting shop for the most part. As an economist, the two things about handsets that are interesting economic issues that interact with the policy world are one issue that's pretty much behind us, and I'm going to touch on it just very briefly, which is the contracts for phones. There was a lot of concern over the anti-competitive behavior, concerns about anti-competitive behavior with locking in customers to handsets. And I think with the contracts being prorated now, that any concerns about that should be behind us, and that by and large, economists look at that as a pretty pro-competitive aspect of the industry. On the exclusivity, from the economic perspective, whether there's competitive harm or not, the concern is about the trade-off between getting a product out there and well distributed versus a manufacturer that has some market power, leveraging that market power downstream. So Apple gave up quite a bit of revenue from other carriers that could have carried the iPhone for the last 4 years. In exchange for that, presumably they got a better deal from AT&T. AT&T certainly got a lot more customers and network traffic as a result of the iPhone, and apparently shared some of that with Apple. I think one of the brief observations I'd like to make about that experience now that it's opening up is it's not obvious that that was the best business move for Apple. I give them credit for knowing their own business, and perhaps it was or probably looked the best. But I think looking at the Android and the fact that its sales are now outstripping the iPhone is a state of the world we would never have seen had the iPhone started off without exclusivity. So from Apple's perspective, it was a trade-off as well. And over the longer term, I think we'll see whether or not that was a good move. Thanks.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming early this morning to this meeting. Well, just tell a little bit about who I work for. I work for the Antitrust Subcommittee. As was said, we're a subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and we have responsibility for oversight of the antitrust laws in every industry, not just in the telecom industry. We've done a lot of work in the telecom industry, though, over the last several years, including about 2 years ago when we launched a major inquiry into the rising costs of text messaging on a per-message basis. And we've also looked at issues such as handset exclusivity. Just in terms of your question on exclusivity, under antitrust law, there's nothing wrong with exclusivity in general. I mean, you can go to Clyde's and they may only serve Coca-Cola products and not Pepsi. They have an exclusive arrangement with Coca-Cola if they do that. I don't know, but I'm just hypothesizing. But that's not a problem, because if you want Pepsi, there's dozens of other places you can go to get it. And of course, Clyde's in the restaurant market in Washington D.C. is a very small part, given the number of restaurants in the city. Where exclusivity becomes an issue in antitrust law is when we're dealing with a monopolist or a company with dominant control of the market, and if it's being used by the monopolist to exclude its rivals from getting something essential to the business. That's sort of the basic law under Section 2 of the Sherman Act, one of the basic antitrust laws. So if you think about exclusivity with handsets, it can come in two directions. It can come from the manufacturer of the handset, or it can come from the cell phone company, which contracts for the handset. Now, until recently, it was AT&T that had an exclusive with the iPhone. There's other exclusivities with other phones, but if we just talk about the iPhone. And, as was just said, it's probably beneficial for the iPhone to want exclusivity in order to sort of drive its rollout in the marketplace. But looked at it from the point of view of the cell phone carrier. The cell phone industry is a highly concentrated market. About 4 carriers with over 90% of the marketplace nationally, and so we think about that now. When we were talking about the iPhone, that's only one of the carriers. So I don't even know what AT&T's market share, but say it's about 20 or 25%. 30. Thank you. Say it's 30%. That's not a monopolist share or a dominant share. On the other hand, issues arise because if other competitive cell phone companies can't get access to the iPhone, they have a very hard time competing. And I'm not talking about Verizon, Sprint, or T-Mobile necessarily, but smaller carriers such as maybe Cellular One in Montana or other carriers who feel they need not just the iPhone but other new smartphones. And how can they have a compelling offering to consumers if they don't have these phones? I think that's where sort of, if it's not an antitrust policy question, it's a telecommunications policy question, arises. We want to see a vibrant cell phone market develop. And especially if we want to see a market that's more than just 4 players, it's important that smaller players have access to these phones. Senator Cole wrote a letter in June of 2009 to the FCC chairman and the head of the Antitrust Division asking for an inquiry into this matter. And it's an issue that we're following closely. Obviously, I'll say one more thing, and then I'll stop. Verizon, which was a very beneficial thing for competition, Verizon got the iPhone recently. But now it's just Verizon and AT&T, who I guess the two of them have maybe 60% of the market, right? And but what about the rest? I mean, that's great for Verizon. It's great for competition for Verizon and AT&T. But we'd like to see, more than just two having access to essential, smartphones such as the iPhone. So I think it continues to be an issue that policymakers have to think about seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. And Harl?
Sure, thanks. So I work with Consumers Union, which is the nonprofit publisher of Consumer Reports magazine. And we've been looking at this issue for the last few years and care a lot about this issue because of the way it affects consumers. And the one thing I've learned, I've been at Consumers Union for 5 months now, and the one thing I've learned is that a lot of our subscribers do care about their cell phone issues and whether or not they can change providers and other issues related to cell phones. So this is an issue that we care a lot about. And so, I think a lot of what Seth has expressed are some of our concerns with the exclusivity agreement. But for us, we look at it more as consumer choice. Can a consumer take their phone from one provider to another provider? Are they locked into a carrier because of ETF? So we look at it as, are consumers able to vote with their feet if they're not happy with their provider? We do an annual survey in January, and we look at the different providers to see what the customer service is like and other issues that may be of concern to consumers. And we found that in the few markets where I think it was Cellular One, where Cellular One was, and we were able to test and survey Cellular One, they by far beat the dominant wireless carriers. But again, it's harder for smaller companies to compete and keep up with that pace. And so I think having the ability to have access to all devices, having the ability to move from one provider to another provider, that's kind of what we're looking at. And one of the impediments, there are a lot of impediments, I think, in the market right now, but one of them is the exclusivity of handsets. And so this is an issue that we continue to look at, as well as other issues, to ensure that consumers do have more choice and are able to vote with their feet if they're not happy with their current provider.
Thank you. Joy.
Okay. Well, I'm with Cellular One. We are a number of companies, and our group was formed in 2005 with a mission to provide value to consumers and businesses in markets that were significantly underserved by the larger national carriers, which generally focus on the nation's top 20 markets. And generally, when they are constructing networks in the states where we provide service, often it's just to provide service along highways for the roamers who are going through those areas. We serve primarily rural markets in Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, Montana, Wyoming, Gulf of Mexico even, with PCS and cellular coverage, and it's nationwide through roaming agreements. And we provide service in these underserved markets, and we endeavor to distinguish ourselves by providing rates and customer care, and we also have a greater presence in the community with more local stores that customers can go into. We feel that we're providing not only mobile coverage but also jobs and community involvement, and we're a real member of these communities. The Cellular One carriers that I represent currently serve approximately 165,000 subscribers. Cellular One is a member of the Rural Cellular Association, which is comprised of nearly 100 rural and regional carriers, most of which serve less than 500,000 subscribers each. And these carriers all endeavor to devote local service and attention to the needs of American consumers. According to the FCC's latest wireless competition report, roughly 86% of the geographic area of the United States is rural. So a large part of the country is where many of the carriers in this association are focusing their efforts. There is an impact on customers of second and third tier carriers. These are sort of FCC classifications, the smaller and regional carriers, stemming from the widespread practice of these handset exclusivity agreements. The segment of customers that we serve is harmed by this practice. The smaller carriers simply do not have access to certain handsets. and are only able to access some of these handsets months after the nation's largest wireless carriers, and then often only in very small end-of-life quantities. We might receive a lot of 1,000 handsets because the largest carrier that provides this particular model has moved on. Consumers often expect, they desire, they want these great, new, exciting devices that they've seen advertised, but smaller carriers often cannot convince manufacturers to sell us the devices so that we can sell them to consumers. As a result, whenever an exciting new handset comes on the market, the smaller carriers lose customers. We experience a sharp decrease in our ability to win new customers, and this has a compounding effect because fewer handsets means fewer customers for the small carrier, which results in less revenue, less profitability, which decreases our ability to invest in new technologies. This diminishes the spread of broadband in our rural areas where the FCC is interested in spreading broadband. It diminishes competition in the broadband marketplace, and it lessens our carriers' our ability to support new device offerings. So it's sort of a vicious circle. And for consumers, handset exclusivity lockups frequently result in customers who cannot obtain certain devices just because they live in an area that a particular large carrier doesn't serve. This has, in some cases, included entire states. So we have experienced this. We serve a state where customers could not get a particular very popular smartphone. The Act provides that the FCC will regulate in the public interest, and we do not believe it is in the public interest for certain customers to lack the ability to buy certain consumer products just because of where these citizens live in our country. Handset exclusivity forces consumers outside of the top markets to choose between local stores, responsive customer service, good coverage of their local areas, which are far from cities or highways, versus a device that the consumer desires. Maybe it would be very convenient for their business to have some of the features of this device. Or perhaps they're a member of the law enforcement or public safety community, and so this device offers the latest and greatest. But that's a choice that they need to make. And I think that's difficult for consumers. And lack of access to devices often has trickle-down effects as well. Currently, the only difference in the FCC's hearing aid compatibility requirements, for example, between Tier 1 and other carriers is 3 months delayed implementation of the requirements. We have 3 extra months to meet the rules. The rules require carriers to offer many different handsets in our stores, many, many different handsets. But lack of access to many handsets can make it harder for small carriers to purchase enough of the kinds of devices that comply with these rules in order for us to be compliant with the rules. So that can be a little bit of a challenge. Also, with reduced access to smartphones and data devices, smaller carriers experience lower lifetime value from our customers. RCA had a 2010 benchmark survey which found that small carriers gain significantly lower value over a lifetime of subscribership from customers based on a data ARPU, that's average revenue per user for the uninitiative, that is far lower than the major carriers' data ARPU, despite similar voice ARPU levels. And the major carriers have higher data ARPU. They're getting more data revenue from their subscribers because they have higher subscriber uptake of advanced data services, including high-priced unlimited data plans. And I'll leave you to decide whether that might be because the larger carriers have the first access to smartphone devices. Even when there is access to devices by smaller carriers, in order to offer these devices for sale at prices comparable to the national carriers, we may occasionally have to pay more for these devices to obtain them from manufacturers because we are ordering in smaller quantities. We don't have volume. We cannot always get the volume discounts. And also, we may occasionally, therefore, need to absorb a larger handset subsidy for the customer. We take a larger bite in order to compensate and offer these handsets to customers at the same prices, even though we're smaller carriers. And we also think there's another impact on the market, which is that exclusives mean the largest companies don't have to work in so many other ways to attract customers, providing better services, lowering their prices, preventing drop calls. and doing all the other things that are positives for consumers. I also subscribe to another wireless service, and when I call customer service, I have to wait on hold forever. When I call our customer service, the pickup time is 6 seconds or less by a live person. That's the kind of customer care that we can offer to try to distinguish ourselves. But this is another way that exclusives can provide a competitive advantage for the major companies because they don't have to put that kind of effort into things to retain their customers. So it's to the detriment of customers. Regarding the iPhone developments, we have yet to observe whether the stated end of exclusivity is going to impact smaller carriers. Apple has said that it plans to review carriers for various criteria. It's impossible for us to estimate how long this review process will take or what will be the results. In a letter to Congress, Verizon did agree to make all exclusive handsets that are CDMA available to smaller carriers 6 months after launch. To my knowledge, there has been no such positive step on the GSM side. We think that Verizon's concession is a step in the right direction for the CDMA world, but due to short runs of devices and frequent launches of new devices, and the time needed to test a device for your network, the access to a device 6 months after launch really may not be soon enough for it to make much of a difference for smaller carriers. I could keep going on, but I should probably wind.
So let's start with the Q&A right now. Now, just quickly, and kind of jumping from the point that you were making, Julia, there is a contention out there that because of exclusivity agreements, carriers, or rather manufacturers, are more able to fine-tune devices. They're able to get it right before they release it to smaller carriers, for which they have to do more fine-tuning. They have to do more work on the handsets before they release it to smaller volumes of sales. And I guess actually, Parul, let me open this one up to you from the consumer side. Do consumers actually win because of the exclusivity agreements in certain ways?
I can.
Okay. Well, do you want to?
Sure. Our experience has been is that consumers don't win. I mean, we did an article a couple of years ago where we had, a priest who had an iPhone, or wanted an iPhone, but he didn't have AT&T service, so he could not use his iPhone because of where he was. And so you could see over the border, where he was, that he had the iPhone but couldn't get service because he had to rely on AT&T service, and in his state, he didn't have AT&T service. So our experience has been that exclusive agreements have not been good for consumers. Like I said, in our survey, we only were able to survey one smaller carrier, but when it came to customer service, they by far were on top of the other carriers. But like you said, they don't always have access to the same devices, and so why they had to make that choice. They may want great customer service, but if they want the best phone, they have to make that choice, and they don't always have access to the best phones.
And I'm sorry.
If I could just interject, I mean,
sure.
I think from an antitrust point of view, consumers win when the market is fully competitive and when consumers have the maximum choice. And I think listening to what Julia was saying, I think that the point she was making was very well taken. And I think from our own research into the cell phone market in a myriad of ways, the market, while there are 4 major carriers, it doesn't seem to operate like a fully competitive marketplace. And I think cell phone exclusivity is one of the reasons why. So no, I don't think consumers win.
Could I jump back in for a moment?
Sure, go ahead.
Just anecdotally, we are aware of instances where manufacturers have provided product lists containing handsets to carriers to order from. The carriers have placed orders, and then they've been told, oh, wait, we can't sell you that handset now. We've pulled it back off of our product list because we've arranged to have an exclusive with X carrier, X large carrier. So the argument that exclusives derive from the large carriers' investment into research on developing these handsets, just generally in our experience, and this is just a generalization, but generally in our experience, that doesn't seem to be the case. And one other point that I'd like to make is some people may say, this is a free market. Why can't the major carriers and the manufacturers just make this decision? It's a contractual decision. This is America, laissez-faire economics. But the free market doesn't exist in telecommunications in America. This is a highly regulated area. in many respects. The FCC regulates manufacturers in many, many different ways, as well as major carriers. The manufacturers have to meet equipment specifications, device compliance, and also, for example, the hearing aid compatibility rules and the disability access rules. And major carriers are subject to the Communications Act, just like small carriers, and antitrust rules. Congress has established as a fundamental goal for commercial mobile radio policy and regulation, in 1993 they mentioned this, the promotion of competition. And the Commission has said that it recognizes that input segments, which is a group that includes devices, can affect entry, competition, output, or prices in the provision of mobile wireless services. So we do believe that the FCC, actually the FTC, the DOJ, these all have jurisdiction and the power and authority to act if they choose to do so. There's actually a petition in front of the FCC that has been pending. It's from RCA. It's been pending for several years now, which the Commission could act upon in order to limit or hopefully halt handset exclusivity agreements.
Coleman.
Yeah, so I want to pick up and amplify something Seth said earlier, which is we're looking at both sort of competition/antitrust policy, and we're looking at telecommunications policy, and it's important to keep those two, I think, separate analytically as we talk about what the issues are here. I disagree that it's clear that the current market for wireless is anti-competitive. I think that case hasn't been proven one way or the other. I think looking forward, absent a change in policy on spectrum, that there might be more concerns. But
if I could, I didn't say it was anti-competitive. I said it wasn't fully competitive.
That's fair. Touche.
Okay.
And the degree of distance between where it is and the fully competitive is an empirical question that would speak to whether there's actual consumer harms coming from these exclusivity contracts. But it is worth noting that the FCC has other policy objectives than just competition. And I think if you try to, from an economist's perspective, it's a harder climb to win this argument on a sort of strict antitrust basis. But if you recognize that the FCC has a great interest in expanding coverage and reducing prices in rural and underserved areas, then the carriers represented by the RCA are playing a hugely important role in fulfilling an important FCC mission. And even if it's not anti-competitive, it's clearly going to be beneficial to them to have access to more handsets, and there might be an argument the FCC could make for forcing open handsets to rural and smaller guys for that purpose. But for them to get into the middle of AT&T and Verizon and how they do exclusivity, I don't think there's much of a policy or economic backing for that.
And that's a good point. And I would like to jump from that in just a moment to the question of whether we're dealing with an oligopoly. Excuse me. But I guess then the question that precedes that is, what are the indicators of good competition in the wireless marketplace, and do they correspond to what constitutes good competition in the wired marketplace? And Seth, it looks like
I thank you for asking that question, because I was going to. So I said the market wasn't fully competitive. It's a pretty strong statement. So why do I say that? And I think it's based partially, and not only, but partially on the experience we had a couple of years ago when we did our cell phone investigation. And what we found is from the years 2006 to 2008, when we talked about text messaging on a per message basis, not as part of a bundle, but on a per message basis, all four major carriers, AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, and T-Mobile, raised their prices, doubled their prices, raised their prices by 100%, first from 10 to 15 cents, then from 15 to 20 cents, at around the same time, not exactly the same time, but around the same time. So you think about that. And one other factor to think of, and we had some expert testimony in a hearing we did on this, the cost of a text message each on an individual basis is about 0.3 cents. So it wasn't really a cost base. Obviously there are some costs that go up, like the network gets bigger, they need to build more towers, but in general it really wasn't a cost base price rise. So what does that tell us? I think it tells us that it's not a fully competitive market. Now, there were some lawsuits brought against the cell phone companies alleging conspiracy and alleging collusion, and those were all dismissed. And we didn't find any evidence of collusion. That's not what we found or not what we said. But what we said is that in a fully competitive marketplace, each individual actor acting alone would not be expected to double its price at around the same time for this service, not cost-based in any way. I think it's a big indicator there. It's interesting, actually, since we launched our inquiry, they haven't raised the cost of text messaging on a per-message basis. I wonder if that's something to do with the scrutiny. But I think that's one indicator that it's not, and it isn't, I guess I'm jumping ahead to your next, I think it is a sort of a pretty tight oligopoly. There's other indicators, which I think my colleague from Consumers Union probably can speak to, other things that cell phone companies really don't engage, I think, in vigorous price competition. A lot of the competition now is over service and over quality, which you don't see as you did maybe in the first 5 years of the first decade of the 2000s, where prices kept dropping in different bundles where packages were offered. So I think it's natural when you have 4 companies, that it's not just in the cell phone industry that you see things like this. It's natural when you have 4 companies with such a dominant market share that it's going to be less than a fully competitive marketplace. And that's why it's important to give smaller carriers such as Cellular One, and we hear from all the RCA carriers, not just them, who have the same complaint that were so aptly expressed by Julia. That's why it's essential that these new carriers. At our hearing, we had Cricket, which is another one that had a lot of the same complaints. Adequate room to compete against the dominant carriers.
And that's all.
An alternative on the text messaging is that text messaging isn't a separate product market from cell phone service. And I think, if we look at the average price per minute of cellular service, right, it's gone down and now it's flattened out. But it's also got a lot of data in there now and data services.
Right,
so we have to unpack that. But there's no, from a pricing perspective, we've seen an industry that over a generation since its inception in the 80s. Is that one generation or two now? I'm feeling my age. Price has gone steadily down up until very, very recently, and even then it's questionable if it's properly measured whether or not it's continued to go down. So there's no obvious sign of of market power there. If you look at the concentration ratios at the national level, although it is only 4 dominant carriers, there is the competitive fringe, and it's not raising red flags. If you look at subscriber shares and do HHIs or whatever, you're not raising red flags about how concentrated the industry is. At a national level, there are local variations in their local markets where it matters, and the FCC, in mergers requires divestiture in certain markets, but at the national level, and the DOJ does too, but at the national level, it's not, there's a lot more concentrated industries out there.
There are more concentrated industries, but I think, without getting too technical, if we did an HHI analysis of the 4 major carriers, I think it would come over, wouldn't it be more than 2,500 points of making?
Yeah, and I think especially when I do think the appropriate market is the local levels. I mean, I think you're right. Maybe if you look at the national level, the HHI market, the HHI level might not be as high, but I think in the competition report when they looked at the local markets, the HHI levels were off the charts. So, and I think for us, the local markets are the relevant markets.
This was the FCC's May 2010 wireless.
And for anybody uninitiated in HHI, that's the measure of concentration used in the antitrust world to decide whether the market is concentrated. It's an index. And you said it was 2,800?
It was slightly over 2,800.
Yeah, so under the Justice Department guidelines, anything over 2,500 is considered to be a highly concentrated market. So I think the cell phone market is a highly concentrated market.
It certainly is more concentrated at the local level if you look at it locally.
And consumers are obviously looking at their local markets to figure out which phones and which providers that they want to go with. So that's why we think the local market is the appropriate.
And I don't want to pretend that there isn't local differences in competition, but all the national carriers have national pricing plans. So, they can have they can do promotions and whatnot, but the sort of general price level is set at the national competitive level.
And just kind of getting on the HHI levels, I think I saw the same report that you did, Julia, and it said that the HHI had gone up 30% between 2004 and 2009 or 2010. and the one I was looking at, I think, was the GAO report, but I presume that they were probably using similar figures. Now, in that same report, which leads me well into the next question here, the GAO found that consumers are much more likely to buy a phone than to buy a service, or buy the network, so to say. Do these exclusivity agreements then open the door for network providers who have, a smartphone that nobody else can get? Does it open the door for them to offer, I don't want to say substandard service, but certainly it doesn't give them an impetus to develop their services as vociferously as they might otherwise?
Well, in our experience, in our observations.
I think Julia was making very good points. I mean, if you have this phone, you don't have to worry so much about customer service, and you could do it across a whole spectrum of services. The phone itself is such a driver of consumer preference that I think that's right.
Have you seen any effect on price points as a corollary to that?
Well, price points are almost, not necessarily, but certainly generally going to be higher for the large, the big four carriers than for the small rural and local carriers, because that's one way that we can distinguish ourselves is by offering the same service at a lower price to our local customers.
But I think there's a fundamental sort of irony or observation here, which is we're trying to talk separately about the carrier market and the handset market. And you just raised a question about customers care about handsets, so maybe the competitive margin is in the handset market. But does anybody doubt that the handset market is has far more options in it today because of the iPhone exclusivity contract? Because it made a lot of room for other handsets to go to the other carriers and develop in a way that had Apple taken a different path and made it available to everybody, we'd all have iPhones today, and Google probably would be funding the Android, and it would be out there, but it would not be beating the share off of.
No, I think that's a very good point. I mean, to give both the handset manufacturer and the cell phone companies their due, I mean, the argument is that these kinds of arrangements help differentiate each company. So there's competition among the companies on the type of phones they have. I mean, and until recently, AT&T had the iPhone, and I guess Verizon had the Android. I think that's right. And the Android
and others.
Right, Verizon and others. So that's certainly an argument. I think you have to, and that's I think, as you said, it's also a matter. It's a matter of communications policy. I mean, what you have to weigh that against. Does the exclusives really disadvantage smaller carriers in a way that's harmful to consumers? I mean, I think what you say is true, and the other may be true as well.
I, as always, like to add something, which is that if you are a major carrier such as Verizon or Sprint, perhaps you have the resources and the subscriber accounts that you can go to a manufacturer and say, please develop an exclusive for me or with me. And the manufacturer may well do that, but as smaller carriers, we cannot go to manufacturers and say, can you develop a phone just for us? And in fact, on the CDMA side of the equation, my companies don't mostly have CDMA. We're mostly GSM, but we have a little bit. But I know that CDMA carriers had banded, some of the smaller carriers had banded together to try to get an exclusive phone just for themselves to offer to their customers. I think they got one. They managed to secure one exclusive from manufacturers. So really some of us just don't have that market power that enables us to compete in that way. And I think if you're willing to say, okay, well, the market is just going to devolve to two carriers, that's probably where we're going to end up, and we're okay with that, then that's a conclusion that you would need to draw. But otherwise, I think you need to think about the fact, is this okay? Is this a level playing field, or do we need to do something here?
I can't imagine it ever devolved to two, that any of the authorities would ever let that happen. But you're quite right. There is there is a difference between what's the consumer harm and what's the competitor harm, right? And there are policies that could harm the smaller rural firms that might not harm consumers. And as we said, the FCC might have a separate interest in making sure that there's these competitors out there. But I'd like, you got to keep the analysis to where the consumer.
But I don't think the answer, although we've heard a lot about rural, it's not just about rural. I mean, I don't think there's any reason in the major cities of this country we should be satisfied with only 4 cell phone carriers, and that's why we have others, but
5 or 6.
Well, but they're 4 major ones in each city by and large, and we had testimony from Cricket, as I said at our hearing, and they would like to, and they have come into urban areas. They'd like to roll out their service in a major way. They have problems getting access to handsets. They have problems with things like data roaming, which we haven't talked about yet today. So the rural issue is very important. It's 86% of the country by area, but I'm not sure what it is by population. It might be, I don't know,
17.
Thank you.
And just really quickly, just to pick up on what Seth said, I mean, it is also an issue in urban areas. In my prior job, we worked a lot with low-income communities in urban areas, and, a lot of them wanted the smartphones and wanted the more expensive phones but couldn't afford the service, and they ended up hacking into the iPhone so they can go to a competitor and get service from there. And so, even in the urban areas, even the price points for a monthly service is too high for some folks. So I think Seth's right, that it's not just a rural problem, it's an urban problem too.
We have an audience question over here.
Let Susan go first.
Okay, Susan, there you go.
Hi, this is questions for Seth. I'm Susan Hoyler from Qualcomm. You said just a moment ago that 4 carriers isn't enough, but looking at it from an international perspective, like Europe or Japan or Korea, they don't seem to have more than 4 or 5 carriers. So, I mean, how much is enough or not enough? Because you're dealing with a fairly large, expensive network that it's not just anybody can enter the market. So I wish you could expand on that. 4 carriers isn't enough.
Well, it's all good points. I mean, I guess if I said 4 carriers isn't enough, I may have misspoke. I mean, I thought I said we'd like to see more than just 4. There's nothing sacred about 4. We used to have 6 national carriers, I guess, about 4 or 5 years ago before a couple of mergers. Well, what's enough? I think the antitrust answer is the market should decide what's enough. I think when we see things like what happened with cell phone text messaging, that leads us to believe that maybe 4 is not enough. I mean, it doesn't seem, when you have sort of an oligopoly, it becomes easier for companies not to engage in vigorous price competition, just on an individual basis, without any need for any kind of conspiracy or collusion. They just can respond to what's going on in the marketplace. 4 is better than 3, but it's not as good as 6. So, but I think the way to look at it is what is going on in the market. Do we see enough competition? As was pointed out, now the cost of the voice plans have flattened out; they're not going down anymore. We see things like the experience with the text messaging. I think the only test is the market. But what we would like to do is see conditions that make it possible for challengers to challenge sort of the big 4. That's basically what it's about, and to bring more competition into the market. I don't know what the right number is. And maybe if some of these policies were changed, the 4 competing amongst themselves would be enough. But we just like to see a more open marketplace for cell phone competition.
More spectrum.
More spectrum. That's a good answer.
To all problems.
Just to follow up, again, looking at it from an international perspective, if NTT Docomo or France Telecom want to come in, do the FCC rules allow these carriers to come in, or do they always have to do joint ventures like T-Mobile, I think, does? But is there room for international competition in the carrier market in the U.S.?
I'm not an expert on the FCC rules. I think it would be a great thing for competition if we allowed it, but maybe I'll speak to one of my colleagues who knows.
I think there's trouble with foreign.
I think there is trouble with foreign licensing.
Foreign ownership
right.
licenses.
Right, and that's obviously a barrier to competition. So, but
they invest in
more
companies such as T-Mobile.
Right. More non-economic policy from the FCC.
How do we get more wireless handsets into the marketplace? I know we've been kicking the tires on this so far, but I'm sorry. I'm Tom Fahey. I'm Senior Advisor to Cellcast Technologies. We work very closely with many of the carriers in the Tier 3 space and some of the Tier 2s. Mostly Homeland Security concerns for my clients. However, would you consider a public safety problem? And there's also a competition problem for the carriers. I very much agree with what Julia has said so far, because we get out there and we talk to people. We talk about cell broadcasting. That's one of the things we talk about a lot with our company. However, what about the carriers, the small carriers? The big carriers, in 5-6 years, when the advertising industry is ready to unleash a couple of $1 billion, several $1 billion, into SMSCB advertising, commercial cell broadcasting advertising, will be available via your cell phone. It's an opt-in service. The rural carriers, the Tier 2s and the Tier 3s, they're totally excluded from this area right now. They won't share in that revenue pie. So there will be a revenue thing that Congress will probably look at in 5 or 6 years down the road, while the rurals at the Tier 2 and the Tier 3 levels, because they don't have access to sophisticated smartphones like the Tier 1s, they're getting screwed. There will be a revenue disparity. So your comment, Seth, about, well, they raised their rates and they did this and that. Well, there'll be a further revenue inflow into the carriers in several years. I've met with some of the largest advertising companies in New York, and they're ready to go. Once the technology is available, they're going to go. My second point is, from a public safety standpoint, take CMAS, for example. In 2006, we signed the WARN Act into law. President Bush signed that. In the WARN Act, it had CMAS. CMAS is a public safety feature for cell phones. Most of the rurals in the Tier 3 space decided to opt out because they didn't have access to the smartphones which would allow for the cell broadcasting capability within their networks. This is a problem. It's still a problem. CMAS is supposed to go live April of 2012 next year. Most of the rural carriers in this country still don't have a handset capable of providing that public safety feature to their subscribers. Anybody want to go for that?
Anybody like to comment?
I'll just make a brief observation, which is your first question was about getting more handsets in the marketplace, and then what you described was lots of handsets in the marketplace, just not available to your segment of the marketplace. And I think that's, again, sort of a separate issue about how we want to support the smaller rural, smaller urban carriers as well.
Do you want me to comment?
Yeah, I want to hear what you guys say.
I was waiting for you to
With regard to CMAS, I mean, I can only speak to our companies, but I'm sure that at some point, we will step in, but it's a matter of where do we devote our resources. It's unfunded, and we have limited engineering resources, and so we would need not only to acquire these handsets, but we would also need to spend some of our engineers' extremely precious time in order to implement this on our networks. And again, that's unfunded. I mean, we're like every other small carrier making as efficient use as we can of our engineers' time. So that's just something we need to look at.
Because within CMS, for those carriers who did opt out, though, within, as I understand the rule, is that within 1 year's time after it's operational, again at the Tier 1 level, FCC will come calling again saying, okay guys, 18 months now later, let's get this kicked in. You've got to devote the resources to get it done at this time. Right,
sure. And I think that that's their prerogative. It's understandable. It's a valuable goal. And I think, as citizens, we fully support it. But as a business, you have to find the resources, not just the engineer's time, but also any equipment upgrades that may be necessary and so forth. So.
Former Chairman Boucher on the Telecom Committee, he was going after Verizon last year when, in 2009, when Lowell McAdams, then CEO of Verizon Communications, said he gave that letter saying, okay, look, no exclusivity, 6 months, we'll do it, no problem like that. But the reality is the group you spoke about earlier, the Associated Carrier Group, located in Wisconsin, they said, Green Bay, they said that they've only gotten one phone.
Right.
One phone's all they've gotten.
Right.
This is 30 rural carriers. carriers that have banded together in the Associated Carrier Group to petition. They were the ones who started the dialogue originally with Verizon Corporation, and Verizon said, no problem. So we wrote to Verizon. 6 months have gone past since the Droid X has been released on the market. Not one rural carrier in the country has it.
Right. I've heard that despite Verizon stating that after 6 months they would let their exclusives slide, the manufacturers have actually balked because they know that it's not helpful to their biggest customer despite that concession, and so the smaller CDMA carriers have in some cases been unable to get the exclusives after the 6 months.
Samsung said that they would go for it, no problem, but again, it's a 100,000 minimum order. Many of the rural carriers in this country hardly have 100,000 subscribers, as you've already noted.
Paul Kirby with TR Daily. I had two questions, one for Coleman and one for Seth. For Seth, is your boss planning any more hearings or any more probes of either this issue or other wireless issues this year? And then for Coleman, you seem to say you shouldn't upset the exclusive handset agreements, but maybe for rural carriers, maybe in fact the FCC should require that rural carriers can get some of those agreements that are subject to exclusive handsets agreements. I wanted to get your reaction to that.
I can answer your first question very quickly. We don't have any plans. My boss doesn't have any plans of that in present. Actually, but to be precise, technically the subcommittee, the actual subcommittee, has not been formed yet this year. We expect that in the next week or two. At that point, we'll release an agenda of our plans for the year. But currently, there are no such plans.
I think my point was more about the Connecticut Compromise and the structure of our Congress. If you want to have a telecommunications policy that makes sure that these devices are available in rural and other underserved areas, the case has not been proven on economic grounds. If you want to do it because you just want to serve these folks, that's fine. But that's a policy choice you can make. Probably not one I'm prepared to support yet, but it wouldn't be made on economic grounds.
Parul, you had mentioned earlier barriers to switching carriers for consumers. Julia, you had mentioned that even within your organization you have some CDMA carriers and some GSM carriers. Does the CDMA-GSM dichotomy further these problems? Is this something that should be rectified where everyone kind of moves to a common protocol, or is this contributing to competitiveness? Anybody?
I do think that heightens the problem, and I think we're seeing, in the 700 megahertz band, they're rolling out LTE technology, but you've seen, I think, some of the folks in this room petition the FCC to look into what's going on, because you're going to further see interoperability issues. Even though you have the same technology being used in the 700 megahertz band, you'll still be in the same situation where you are now, where you can't just take your phone from one carrier to another carrier because of the standards that are being set. So, in addition, I do think interoperability issues are an issue for consumers who would like to switch, and, it's more logical now because of the CDMA, GSM difference. But, when you get to a point where you're using the same technology in the 700 megahertz band, you conceivably should be able to switch carriers more easily, and I think we're starting to see that may not even happen even there.
So 1 point, 2 examples. There is always a trade-off between there's often a trade-off, especially in telecommunications, between a sort of technical efficiency and an economic efficiency. So the 2 examples, one is the most efficient cellular network would be to give all the spectrum to one company and have them build one integrated network with no guard channels and common communication control channels, and that would be the most the highest capacity network you could build. But of course, you then have to regulate the prices, and that's an inefficient process. So we tolerate some inefficiency in the network capacity to have multiple carriers, and right now it's about 4 nationally. Where that trade-off should be is an open. I guess we've been talking about it as an open question, but there's always a trade-off there. Similarly, with the technology that's deployed across carriers, there's a trade-off. I find very interesting in the U.S. For the first generation analog phones, there was a standard, a single standard that everybody had to adopt. In Europe, each country got to adopt its own standard. And both countries sort of learned the lesson of their own experience. In Europe, they said, we see they were highlighting the problems of incompatible standards, and so for the second generation GSM, they imposed a Europe-wide standard technology. And in the U.S., we saw the problem of not allowing technological competition and allowed the carriers to pick standards and allowed what ultimately became 3 standards, and it's now sort of down to 2 developed. It was always a trade-off.
Anybody else? Julie?
I think with CDMA and GSM, there will always be some competition, but there's also convergence in the lower bands, and so eventually we will move to a common enough platform that I think some of those issues might potentially resolve themselves, while the equipment makers, of course, can still seek to differentiate themselves with the excellence or innovation of their products. But in the 700 megahertz band, I think it's a pretty disturbing trend that the major carriers essentially are creating islands for their own subscribers by differentiating, so that essentially subscribers will not be able to roam from one carrier to another in the 700 megahertz band. And I believe one of the major regional carriers has attempted to disprove that that's necessary technologically. Perhaps they see it, the major carriers are doing it for competitive reasons, but it doesn't seem to be a technological necessity that there be interoperability, lack of interoperability.
Now, what about unlocking phones? Is this something that right now, if you want to unlock your iPhone, and as I understand it, and I have no independent verification on this, but T-Mobile was very tolerant of people unlocking their iPhones and bringing them over to their network. Is this something that we ought to look at as being more standard and less kind of, I don't want to even say gray market because it's legal, but it's something that you've got to search for, and it's something you've got to be a little bit technically savvy to do. Is this something that we ought to make easier for consumers so that there is an ease of mobility between carriers?
I mean, I think from a competition policy point of view, that probably would be a good thing. I mean, I think all these things you talk about are obstacles to, again, a fully competitive market. If there are barriers placed to consumers to switch carriers, that makes it more difficult for there to be full competition. Another thing you haven't mentioned are early termination fees, long-term 2-year contracts, early termination fees. There has been reform in this area over the last several years with the major carriers prorating. So it used to be that even if a month earlier you'd face this financial penalty, now you face a much smaller. It's prorated per month. But on the other hand, it's not a complete proration. So there's still at the end of the contract still some penalty, or a month. That's not at the end of the contract. A month or 2. There's still some penalty that you have to pay to get out of the contract early. I also noticed that recently one of the major carriers doubled the early termination fee for smartphones. I think it was to $450. So that if it's not a complete proration, that increases the penalty towards the end of the contract. Now, of course, the argument for the contract is that they subsidize the cost of the phones and make the phones cheaper, as I'm sure my colleague would remind me.
No need now.
No need now. But I think this is a barrier to competition that people ought to be concerned about, and something that we called for an inquiry 2 years ago in that letter I referred to. But all these things put together, unlocking the phones, the incompatibility of equipment, all these things put together make it more difficult for consumers to go from carrier to carrier, and that harms the competition in this market. And I think we have to be seriously concerned about these issues if we want to see a fully competitive marketplace.
So it is legal to take your phone, right? The courts ruled that you can unlock your phone. It seems odd to make it easier for somebody who's subsidizing a phone to make it easier for them to move it away. There might be anyway. That's an issue. But the wireless industry is characterized by monthly turnover of around 2% of customers. It's some of the highest churn of any sort of service industry, and that's with the 2-year that's been the history of it back when you had the full penalty. So there's not a lot of evidence of a lack of people moving between carriers and that there being competition between
I presume that 2%, most of those people are people that have fully exhausted their contract.
I suspect that most of them are, but although not quite all, but most of them are. But
right.
but nonetheless, so imagine if that's 2% every 24 months, that's 25% of the people. It's actually greater when you compound, right? Change carriers every 2 years when their contract is up and they've paid for their phone. So I mean that's a lot of competition. Another point about the early termination fees is separate from the fact that it recovers a cost of subsidizing a handset. Is that, and this point may be less relevant today now that prices are no longer on a steeply downward trend. But in a market where you have declining prices, when a carrier is thinking about lowering its price, the decision it has to make is that by lowering its price, it'll attract more customers, but it's going to lose revenue from an existing base of customers. And by being able to lock in customers for a year or two, it allows a carrier's economic decision on the margin to have that price lower. And in a declining market, and in one that's still growing where you're still interested in bringing in customers, the first-time cell phone buyers, and growing the market, I think that those contracts, separate from the subsidy issue, allowed the carriers to price much more aggressively and may have actually expanded the market. Now that we're at we're not as the welfare effects aren't coming as much from bringing new customers into the market, maybe that doesn't hold anymore.
Can I just make one quick point on the ETF? Obviously, I agree with Seth that it's an impediment for consumers to switch carriers. But, even for those consumers who stick it out for the 2 years and maybe even keep their phone, ideally you would think their monthly service or the price point will go down. But they still pay the same monthly service. So even though you finish paying your subsidy, your service price point doesn't change. So it's unclear to me how that matches up because you stick with the same phone, you stick with the same carrier, but your service is still the same price every month.
So you're going month to month. If you re-up for a new contract but keep your phone, they'll give you a discount.
Hasn't occurred. It hasn't happened to me, so I don't know. Maybe carriers.
You have to lock in again, but they'll give you they'll give you the money they would have, or at least a good portion of the money they would have.
Well, that hasn't been, like I said, that hasn't been my experience. So.
And just let me go from there and ask: do carriers subsidizing phones then lead into manufacturers are getting a higher price than maybe they would from a consumer? Does it drive up the price points for handsets artificially? And if those subsidies weren't to be there, or if you ended up in a situation where somebody could unlock a phone and bring it to another carrier easily, it would, the market forces would seem to do away with subsidies. Would that bring the prices down, and would it make for a more open, competitive system?
I think a free market economist would agree with you on that, but I'm not an economist, but I think that's right. I think there's a subsidy there. Yeah, we do have an economist.
I won't comment on the law.
Right.
The price that manufacturers receive for their phones without the subsidy and locking, the first part of the question was, would that price be lower? That may be the case. I'm not entirely sure, but that may be the case. And if it was lower, you'd have less phones and less innovation in phones because there's less revenue to develop new products and put more features into their products. The price paid that the consumer faces, sort of the out-of-pocket price, would clearly be much, much higher. And so in some sense, the subsidy is like a financing option for the phone over the course of a contract. Does that financing option mean that there's more phones sold, that people turn over their phone more often? Probably. So there's probably a lot more rollover, which means there's actually more phones sold, right? If you had to buy, there's no subsidies, you bought your phone, you might keep it cleaner and let it hope it lasts more than 2 years, whereas now we all wait for our contract to come up and get our next subsidized phone. So it's not obvious to me that getting rid of that subsidy although it would increase the movement of phones between networks, it's not clear that would help the actual handset market produce more phones. In fact, I think it would give an incentive for them to produce less and less innovative phones.
Okay, hi. One question I would like to ask is about cost in general. We have a government policy, again, the broadband want to expand the rural areas. They have CMAS requirements on the carriers. The consumers want the best handset at the lowest price. But when I look at the equation, I don't see where the funding of this is going to come. Is the government going to subsidize rural carriers? Are consumers going to pay more for handsets so they can? I don't see in this diverse panel anyone consumers want the lowest price, the networks want the smartest phones, the carriers want the highest revenue, government wants fair competition, but who's going to pay for this? Whose house is going to be spread across all these players? I'd just be curious to hear from different panelists how we're going to have this optimal free market where everybody benefits.
It's not like a broken record, but I mean, I think competition will do that. Obviously, consumers spend billions of dollars collectively on cell phone service. There's a lot of money there. If you have an open, competitive marketplace, I think the genius of competition and the free market should be able to do this. Now, we're talking about subsidies to broadband to deployment of broadband. Already, there's obviously major programs to do that, and so that's a different issue of building out broadband networks. But if you're talking about maximum deployment of the best phones to the most people, competition, if it's allowed to flourish, ought to take care of that. I don't know what my other colleagues have to say about that.
So break it down into the exclusivity that's sort of there for economic reasons. Breaking that, I think, as we talked earlier, changes the flow. There's less money coming from that carrier. There's more coming from others. The handset maker is probably worse off otherwise because they're free to do that now, to not have exclusive contracts. So the handset maker is probably worse off and probably makes less handsets or less innovative handsets. The separate issue is the handset that exists, and they won't sell it. They won't engineer it for a smaller company that has less than 100,000 subscribers. There, it's not so much the exclusivity issue. It's it sounds more like an engineering issue. But if it's a case about sort of a minimum order, then there's at least an opening for government subsidies to say we want to have these handsets in rural carriers' hands or smaller carriers' hands for policy reasons, and putting it in their hands creates extra costs, and so here's compensation for it. I don't know if it's out of universal service or whatever. I think it's an unlikely path, and I also tend to suspect that if that extra cost was made transparent that way, that the option might be a little less attractive, but at least it's an option.
I'd like to point out that with pending changes in the universal service program, it's not even clear the extent to which rural broadband is going to be paid for wireless carriers in high-cost areas. So even as to provision of service, much less handsets, there are some pretty open questions that are of concern to us as we go forward if we are to deploy broadband as to how we are going to be able to afford this in some of our more high-cost areas.
And just kind of getting back to the news of the last week or so with the iPhone moving to Verizon. Now, Verizon actually declined to sign an exclusivity agreement with Apple on the phone. Now, I forget whether it was Parul or Julia, you had mentioned that still has not thus far brought the iPhone to smaller carriers. What does Verizon's declining to sign an exclusivity agreement with Apple on this issue, does it say anything about the future of exclusivity agreements, or is this just merely that they're losing market share to Android? And if it does say something about exclusivity agreements, what does it say?
It says that they were bowing to government pressure on that particular handset, and perhaps that sets a precedent for what could occur with future handsets.
That seems to bounce right to you there, Seth.
I'm very reluctant to make predictions about the future. So I don't know. Also, I mean, it's no longer it wouldn't be exclusive to Verizon because AT&T has it. I think it's a different issue if it's the only carrier to have it. So whether that has a precedential effect for true exclusives remains to be seen.
Yeah, I wouldn't read too much into what the second carrier's contract says.
And I think we have time for one more question before we wrap it up. If anybody has anything from the audience. Seeing none. So then what is the best way to bring more handsets to more networks? And I want to hear from everybody on this one.
So the question always seems to bounce back and forth between more handsets and more handsets to more networks. On the more handsets, it's not obvious to me we need more handsets. There does seem to be quite a bit of competition out there. But to the more networks, I think if there's a desire to get to get these to more rural or other underserved or smaller networks, that somebody has to pay for it and should do so explicitly.
I mean, I think one has to seriously consider whether or not these exclusive arrangements should be permitted, at least with respect to the dominant players in the marketplace. Allowing access to handsets to smaller competitive providers, I think, would be a good thing for this industry. And I guess I think it's just as simple as that.
Our position in the past, and we've asked FCC as well, is to ban exclusive agreements. So that's been our position in the past, and it hasn't changed thus far. And we prefer not to see any exclusive agreements.
Well, we certainly have the same position. We would prefer not to see any exclusivity agreements, and the FCC could certainly act on the petition that's pending before them, or other agencies or Congress could act. I also think that it's important, if we want deployment of broadband and deployment of handsets in rural areas, to sustain some sort of a subsidy mechanism that's going to provide a real continuing universal service subsidy for wireless CATCs. And I think that it's helpful to encourage means of roaming, avoiding these interoperability problems, and encouraging data roaming, requiring that to occur.
Yeah, I didn't mention data roaming, but that's, I think, an important issue too. I mean, so much of what's being used on cell phones, smartphones, is data, is internet connectivity and email. And if smaller carriers don't have access to data roaming, how can they really build out a competitive? How can they really be true competitors in the marketplace? So fulsome data roaming, I think, is very important in this industry.
And it's hard on their customers.
And it's a completely different topic.
It's a completely different topic. That's true. But
For the next one.
We don't have another hour.
All right, well, any last comments then? No? Okay, everybody, please join me in thanking our panel today. I think it's done an excellent job. And thank you again to our sponsors. I will turn it back over to Sylvia.
Thanks very much for coming today. And before we thank our sponsors, I just want to point to you on the second half of the program. You can see our upcoming events at the Broadband Breakfast Club. On Tuesday, March 15th, we're going to have the National Broadband Plan, a one-year update, which should be very exciting. And on Tuesday, April 19th, we have Better Broadband Adoption, What Levers Will Improve Take Rates Nationwide. And so now please join me in thanking our sponsors of the Broadband Breakfast Club, the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, the Telecommunications Industry Association, and U.S. Telecom. Thank you all very much for coming.